The Mafia boss crashed her wedding saying, "You're carrying my child." But they never met before. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was the day of her wedding, and she stood at the entrance of the grand hall, her heart racing. The music played softly in the background as she glanced around the room, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She had dreamed of this day her entire life. The perfect ceremony, the perfect dress, the perfect man. But as she took a deep breath, a sense of unease settled in her chest, an inexplicable feeling that something was off. The doors opened wide, and the guests began to take their seats, the bride's entrance now imminent. She looked down at her bouquet, her hands trembling. Today, she was supposed to begin a new chapter with Ethan, the man she had been with for years. They had shared everything, their lives, their hopes, their future. But as she walked toward the altar, her eyes flicked to the back of the room. A tall, imposing figure stood in the shadows. She felt it before she saw him. The air seemed to shift. His eyes, dark as the night, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Who was he? The man had a presence that demanded attention, and everyone else seemed to part as he stepped forward. For a moment, time slowed, and her steps faltered. She tried to shake it off. It was just nerves. But the feeling only grew stronger as the man began to approach the front. His suit was immaculate, his demeanor confident and cold. The man was a stranger, yet somehow he seemed so familiar. She could hear whispers among the guests, but her focus was solely on him. As he came closer, he stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming. "You're carrying my child," he said, his voice smooth but filled with authority. The words hit her like a freight train. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to process what he had just said. This man, the man who had just crashed her wedding, had no right to be here. She had never seen him before. How could he possibly know such a thing? The guests watched in stunned silence, unsure of what was happening. The air felt thick, like a storm was brewing. The man's eyes never left hers, his expression unreadable. "I'm not leaving without you," he continued, his tone firm and unyielding. "You belong to me now." Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt trapped, like the walls were closing in. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. What was this? Was it a joke? A cruel prank? The man's gaze didn't waver, and his presence grew more suffocating. For a moment, it was as if everything else in the room disappeared. Her future, her wedding, her life with Ethan, all of it felt suddenly distant, unimportant. All she could focus on was this man, the force of his words, the power in his stare. She wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't. Something about him held her there, frozen in place. The guests continued to murmur, their voices a distant hum. The world seemed to blur around her. What was happening? Who was this man, and why was he here? Why had he come to ruin the most important day of her life? The man stepped closer, his gaze still locked on hers. She wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave, but the words wouldn't come. Her heart beat faster, panic rising in her chest. "You're not marrying him," he said, his voice low and intense. "You're marrying me." As the weight of his words settled in, she realized that her life, the one she had planned with Ethan, was never going to be the same again. The man's words lingered in the air like an electric charge, making everything feel still and frozen. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. She blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The man had just walked into her wedding, in front of her friends and family, and claimed that she was carrying his child. The thought felt absurd. She had never seen him before. How could he possibly know something like that? The room seemed to grow smaller, and every set of eyes was on her, waiting for a response. Ethan, her fiancé, stood at the altar, frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. His face was a mask of confusion, anger, and hurt. But it wasn't just Ethan she had to deal with. It was this stranger, this powerful, dangerous man who had just turned her world upside down. Her legs felt weak, her mind racing to catch up. Who are you? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break the silence. The man's expression softened just slightly, but there was no warmth in his gaze. You already know who I am. The question is, what are you going to do about it? His voice was calm, measured, but there was an undeniable authority in it, a weight that made her feel small, insignificant. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some misunderstanding. He was serious. I'm not going anywhere, he continued, his voice steady. And neither are you. You belong to me now, and you will never leave. His words were firm, unyielding. He didn't even flinch as she stepped back, trying to distance herself. The guests in the room had gone completely silent, watching in stunned disbelief as this man, this stranger, asserted control over her life. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, a mixture of shock, pity, and curiosity. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell them all this was some mistake, but the fear that gripped her heart held her in place. The man's eyes never left hers. You know, he said with a small, unsettling smile. You could have had a normal life, a normal wedding, a normal future with him. He nodded toward Ethan, who still stood frozen. But you chose to be here, in this moment, with me. The words hit her like a slap. She felt her stomach twist in knots. This wasn't how she had imagined her life turning out. She had always dreamed of a simple life, one where she could fall in love, get married, and build a future. But now, that dream was slipping away, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. Ethan's voice finally broke through the tension, though it was shaky, filled with disbelief. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. The man, whose name she still didn't know, turned his cold, calculating eyes toward Ethan. Stay out of this, he said sharply, and there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. Ethan stepped forward, but the security in the room, silent figures she had never noticed before, moved quickly, blocking his path. It was clear that this man had power, real power, and Ethan, for all his anger, was out of his depth. Please, just let me go, she whispered, her voice trembling, but she knew it was useless. There was no escaping this man, no running away from the path he had already set her on. His gaze softened, but only slightly. You don't get it, do you? He said, almost with a touch of pity. This isn't about what you want. It's about what I need, and now you're part of that. She wanted to shout, to push him away, to run from the situation, but the room felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her as the weight of his words crushed down on her chest. This wasn't just about control, it was about power. This man had been watching her, and he knew everything about her. Everything. She didn't even know how to respond. What could she say? How could she make sense of this? I'm not your property, she finally managed to say, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. The man took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Oh, you will be, he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Whether you like it or not, you are already mine. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never felt more trapped in her entire life. No, she said, shaking her head, trying to push against the fear building inside of her. I can't. I won't. But the man was relentless, and the cold, unyielding look in his eyes told her that there was no way out. Not now. Not ever. The room felt like it was spinning. She looked around at the people who had once been part of her life, the friends and family who should have been celebrating her happiness, but instead, they all seemed to fade into the background. She felt alone, isolated, as if this man had somehow erased everything she had once known. The man stepped closer again, and this time, his voice was low, but filled with something darker. You'll see. This is just the beginning, and you'll soon realize that you belong with me. Her heart skipped a beat as his words settled deep within her, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. This was not a wedding. This was a takeover. A life-altering, irrevocable shift that would change everything she thought she knew about herself, her future, and the man who had just walked into her life, uninvited and unstoppable. The cold, calculating eyes of the Mafia boss never left her as the room fell into a heavy silence. His presence was overpowering, like a shadow that consumed everything around her. She stood there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The wedding she had spent so much time planning, the life she had imagined with Ethan, had all been shattered in an instant. This man, this stranger, had not only crashed her wedding but had also claimed her as his own, declaring that she was carrying his child. The words echoed in her mind, refusing to leave. The weight of it all made her feel dizzy, as if the ground beneath her feet had been pulled away. Ethan, still standing at the altar, was no longer the man she recognized. His face was twisted with anger and confusion, his eyes filled with hurt. She could feel his gaze on her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the man who now stood in front of her, a figure of power and control. I don't understand. Ethan's voice cracked as he stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Who the hell are you? The Mafia boss finally turned his gaze away from her, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with an almost amused glint. Who I am doesn't matter, he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. What matters is what happens next. Ethan took another step toward him, but before he could get any closer, two large men in suits appeared from the shadows, blocking his path. The Mafia boss's security, no doubt. Stay out of this. The Mafia boss ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. She's not yours to fight for anymore. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, his face reddening with fury, but there was nothing he could do. The power in this room wasn't his to command. You don't know what you're doing. Ethan growled, his voice strained with frustration. She's my fiancée. You can't just walk in here and claim her. The Mafia boss stepped closer to her, his presence now looming over her like a dark cloud. She felt the urge to step back, to put some distance between them, but her body refused to obey. There was something magnetic about him, something that held her in place. You're wrong, he said, his voice low and steady. She was never really yours. His words stung like a slap, and for a brief moment, she felt the truth in them. She had never truly been in control of her own life. Her parents had chosen her path. Her future with Ethan had been neatly planned out, but now everything felt uncertain. You belong with me now, he continued, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. The touch was surprising, gentle, but commanding. She shivered, not sure how to react. This wasn't how she had imagined her life. She had always believed in love, in making choices for herself, but this man's presence seemed to shatter every belief she had held. I don't want this, she whispered, her voice shaking. The Mafia boss's eyes softened just a fraction, but there was no sympathy in them. I'm not asking you, he said, his voice firm. You will come with me, whether you want to or not. His words were final. There was no room for argument. As the realization set in, she felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. She had no choice in the matter. Her life, her future, had been decided for her in that single moment. I won't go with you, she said, her voice growing stronger despite the fear bubbling in her chest. I don't care who you are. I'm not going anywhere with you. The Mafia boss regarded her with a cold, unblinking stare. You don't have a choice, he said simply. You're mine now, and I don't take no for an answer. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to make her own decisions, but now she was powerless. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. She looked around the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to come to her aid. But all she saw were the eyes of the guests, staring in stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all waiting for her to react, to do something. But what could she do? How could she fight against a man who had already taken control of everything? The Mafia boss turned toward the door, his back straight and unyielding. Come with me, he commanded, his voice brokering no argument. His security detail flanked him as they moved toward the exit, and she had no choice but to follow. Every step felt like a betrayal of everything she had once wanted, of the life she had dreamed of with Ethan. She glanced back at him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the sea of guests who watched the scene unfold with silent shock. You're not going to get away with this, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. The Mafia boss didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He already knew that she was powerless to stop him. The drive to the Mafia boss's mansion was long and silent, the black SUV gliding smoothly over the asphalt as it cut through the dark streets. She sat in the back seat, her eyes glued to the window, watching the city lights blur into nothingness. The weight of the man's words, his cold, unrelenting control, still hung heavy in the air. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The wedding, the life she had planned, everything had been ripped away in an instant. She glanced around, hoping for some form of reassurance, but the quiet of the vehicle only made the situation worse. The bodyguards in the front seats sat still, their eyes focused straight ahead, their presence like an invisible force that reminded her she had no control. Her hand gripped the seat, the tension in her body unbearable. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers, but she couldn't find her voice. What had happened? How had her life spiraled so quickly? You don't have to worry. The Mafia boss's voice broke the silence, his tone calm, but with an edge of authority that made her stomach churn. You'll be safe here. I'll make sure nothing happens to you. Safe. The word felt like a cruel joke. How could she feel safe with a man who had just stolen her life away? She turned toward him, her eyes filled with defiance. Safe? She repeated, her voice shaky. You think I'll feel safe here, with you? After everything you've done? He didn't flinch at her words. His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers with a piercing gaze. You don't understand yet, but you will, he said softly, the finality of his words sinking in. She wanted to scream, to throw herself out of the car, but the truth was, she was powerless. There was nowhere to go. The city was a blur outside, but it was all foreign to her now. Her world had been turned upside down, and this man, this stranger, was the cause of it all. When they arrived at the mansion, the gates opened automatically, and the car pulled through with ease. She had heard of places like this before, mansions hidden behind high walls, where the rich and powerful lived, but never in a million years had she imagined she would be brought here, against her will. The SUV came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, where a few more men in black suits stood, their faces unreadable. The mansion loomed in front of her like a fortress, its cold stone exterior reflecting the moonlight. The man beside her opened the door and stepped out, his movements precise and calculated. He turned to her, extending a hand. Come with me, he said, his voice like velvet, but carrying an undeniable weight of command. She hesitated, her body still tense with resistance. But what choice did she have? She stepped out of the car, her feet hitting the cold ground, and followed him inside. The mansion was everything she had imagined, luxurious and imposing, with marble floors, high ceilings, and art pieces that probably cost more than she would earn in her entire life. She couldn't help but feel small, insignificant, as she walked through the vast hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. This is your new home, he said, his voice trailing behind her like a shadow. You'll stay here, and you'll follow my rules. For now, it's for your protection. Protection? She wanted to laugh. At the absurdity of it. Protection from whom? From him? From the life she had been forced into? They reached a room at the end of the hallway, and he opened the door, ushering her inside. This will be your room, he said simply. The room was grand, decorated with expensive furniture and thick, velvet curtains that blocked out the light. A large bed sat in the center, its covers pristine and untouched. She glanced around, her heart sinking further. This was not her life. This was not the life she had wanted. I'll have someone bring you food in the morning, he said, his voice now distant. Rest. Tomorrow we'll talk more. He turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. And just so you know, he added, you are mine now. I don't take kindly to disobedience. His words were chilling, and she felt the full weight of his power settle over her like a dark cloud. He walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, staring at the empty space around her. Alone. Trapped. The reality of her situation hit her like a wave, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. She didn't know how long she stayed there, crying silently, her body racked with sobs. How had everything gone so wrong? She had no answers, no escape. The man who had ruined her life was still out there, controlling everything. And now, she had nowhere to turn. She couldn't even run. This was her new reality. She was his, whether she liked it or not. The morning came with an oppressive stillness. She woke up in the vast, luxurious room, the soft, velvety curtains drawn shut, casting the space in a dim, muted light. The clock on the nightstand read 8 in the morning. She hadn't slept well, her mind racing with fear and confusion, and her heart heavy with the weight of her new reality. She had hoped it was all a nightmare, that somehow she would wake up and find herself back in the life she had known. Before the wedding, before the Mafia boss had entered her life and shattered everything. But this was no dream. It was real, and she was here, locked in a gilded cage. She sat up in bed, running her hands through her hair, the reality of her situation sinking in further. She was a prisoner, but not in the typical sense. There were no bars, no locked doors. The prison was the man who controlled everything. Vu Hai, the Mafia boss who had taken her life from her with a single declaration. She got out of bed slowly, her legs shaky, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. As she moved to the window, she saw the sprawling estate outside, its manicured gardens and towering iron gates. It looked beautiful from the outside, but it was a prison just the same. She wanted to scream, to break free, but the truth was, there was nowhere to go. The world outside those gates didn't belong to her anymore. The world inside this mansion didn't either. A soft knock on the door broke the silence, and before she could answer, the door opened. A woman entered with a tray of food, dressed in a simple black uniform. She was tall, elegant, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Mr. Vu Hai asked me to bring you breakfast," the woman said, her voice calm, almost detached. "I will leave it here. If you need anything, do not hesitate to ask." She set the tray down on the small table by the window and made her way to the door. "Thank you," she said, but the woman didn't respond, just left the room as quietly as she had come in. The door closed softly behind her. She turned to the tray, her stomach twisting in knots. She was supposed to eat. She needed to eat, but she had no appetite. Everything about this place felt foreign. She picked up the coffee cup, the scent of it strong and bitter, but as she took a sip, it only made her feel more alone. She put the cup down, staring out the window at the garden below. The world seemed to continue on, oblivious to the fact that her entire life had just been upended. The door opened again, this time with a purposeful knock. She turned, already knowing who it was. Vu Hai stood in the doorway, his tall, imposing figure blocking the light from the hallway. His presence filled the room, commanding and undeniable. "Good morning," he said, his tone smooth, but there was an edge to it. "I trust you slept well." She didn't answer, her lips pressed together in a tight line. His gaze didn't leave her, and for a moment, it felt like he was waiting for her to speak, to give him some sort of response. But she had nothing to say. She didn't want to engage with him, not after everything that had happened. "You're upset," he said, stepping into the room, his voice never losing its calm, authoritative tone. "Understandable. I didn't expect you to be happy about this." He moved closer, and she instinctively stepped back, her heart racing. But there was no room to retreat. He was too close. "You will understand in time," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "This is for your own good. You are safer here. You will be taken care of." "I don't need your protection," she said, her voice more forceful than she intended. "I didn't ask for any of this. I don't want to be here." He didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have a choice," he said simply. "You belong to me now, whether you like it or not." The words hit her like a slap. She had hoped, for a fleeting moment, that there might be some kind of misunderstanding, that somehow she could leave. But the reality was clearer now than ever. There was no escape. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "I will never be yours." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You will be," he said softly, almost gently, but the finality in his tone made her blood run cold. "And when you finally accept that, everything will be easier for you. I'll protect you, but you must learn to trust me." "I can't trust you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know who you really are." He paused, his gaze softening just slightly. "I am the man who controls everything. Your safety, your future, your life, it all depends on me. And I don't share what's mine." His words sent a chill down her spine. She had never felt more trapped, more isolated, in her entire life. "Now," he said, stepping back and gesturing to the breakfast tray. "Eat. You need your strength. There is much to discuss today." She didn't move, her body rigid with resistance. But she knew, deep down, that nothing she said or did would change the situation. She was in his world now, and the rules of that world were set by him, and he wouldn't let her forget it. The days that followed felt like a blur, a strange mix of confusion and resignation. She tried to hold on to the remnants of her old life, the life she had planned with Ethan, but everything seemed to slip further away with each passing moment. She was trapped in a world she didn't understand, surrounded by luxury and danger, with no escape. Vu Hai, the Mafia boss who had stolen her life from her, watched her every move, his cold, calculating eyes always following her. It wasn't just the physical barriers. There were no locked doors or chains, but his power, his control, was all-encompassing. She was a prisoner, but in a way, she had never been before. The mansion, with its towering walls and vast grounds, felt like a gilded cage. At times, she would stand by the window in her room, staring out at the world she used to know, but the more she looked, the more distant it all seemed. She couldn't even remember what it felt like to be free. Every step she took was measured, every word she spoke weighed. It was like living in a constant state of tension, always on edge, always aware of his presence. Vu Hai never left her alone for long. He would check in on her frequently, his voice always calm, always authoritative, but there was an edge to it that made her want to push back, to refuse him. But she knew better. He was always right there, watching, waiting for her to make a wrong move. Her life now revolved around him, his decisions, his rules, his desires. She tried to keep a part of herself hidden, a piece of her former self that resisted, that fought back. But the more she resisted, the more she felt the weight of his power bearing down on her. One evening, after a particularly tense day where Vu Hai had insisted she join him for dinner in the grand dining room, she found herself sitting across from him at the massive table, the only sound between them the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. The food was exquisite, of course. Nothing less would be served in his mansion, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. She had no appetite. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt hunger, not for food, not for anything. "I trust you're settling in well," he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet, but with an undertone of something darker. He watched her with that same intensity that made her feel both seen and invisible at the same time. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice tight, not wanting to show any weakness. She wasn't about to let him think he had broken her, even though every part of her wanted to scream and fight back. "Good," he said, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Because this life we're building together isn't just for me, it's for you too. You're part of this now, and that means following my lead." "I don't need your lead," she said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. "I never asked for any of this." His gaze didn't waver. "You'll learn to appreciate what I'm offering you," he said quietly, his voice still calm, but with a hardness that made her stomach tighten. "I've given you safety, protection, and now I'm offering you stability. Everything you've ever wanted is here. All you have to do is accept it." "I don't want any of this," she said through gritted teeth, the anger bubbling up from within her. "I don't want you. I don't want your world." He leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You don't. You belong to me now, and there's nothing you can do about it." His words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The realization that she had no control over her own life, that this man held all the power, washed over her in a rush of cold dread. She felt trapped, suffocated by his presence, his authority. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew there was nowhere to go. "You don't get to decide what I want," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I've already decided," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. "You'll come to see it. In time, you'll understand." His eyes never left hers, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he was right. Could she really come to accept this life? Could she really come to accept him? She shook the thought away, refusing to let herself go down that path. She would not let him win. Not like this. Not without a fight. But in the back of her mind, the fear gnawed at her. What would happen if she couldn't escape? What would happen if she was forced to stay? The meal passed in silence after that, the tension thick between them. She could feel his eyes on her the entire time, watching her every move, analyzing her, trying to figure out what she would do next. But she kept her head down, focusing on the food in front of her, trying not to let him see the storm raging inside her. After dinner, he didn't leave immediately. He stayed seated, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're not like the others," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. You don't bend easily. I admire that. But don't mistake that for weakness. In time, you'll see the value in what I offer. In time, you'll understand that this is your new reality. He stood up, his movements smooth and controlled. Rest well tonight, he said. Tomorrow is another day, and it will be a day of your choosing. But remember this, you're mine now, and there's no turning back. With that, he turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. She sat there for a long time, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. Her life was no longer her own. She was trapped in his world, and there was no escape. The days that followed felt like a slow, suffocating haze. Every moment she spent in that mansion, surrounded by luxury she didn't want and a man she couldn't escape, chipped away at the parts of her that once felt like herself. Vu Hai, the Mafia boss, had made it clear, she belonged to him now. It didn't matter what she wanted, what she thought, or how hard she fought. Every waking hour she was reminded of her helplessness. He kept her in the mansion, never letting her out of his sight for too long. She had been given a room, meals, clothes, but all of it felt like a prison. Her life had become an endless cycle of silence, anxiety, and the weight of his control. But as the days dragged on, something in her began to shift. At first, she had tried to resist him, to ignore him, to maintain some semblance of independence. But every time she pushed back, Vu Hai would only tighten his hold, always watching, always waiting. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His presence alone was enough to make her feel small and insignificant. It was in the way he looked at her, the coldness in his gaze that seemed to pierce through her very soul. He had power, the kind of power that could break anyone. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than the icy exterior he showed to the world. There were moments, brief glimpses, when his mask would slip, and she would see something else in his eyes. A vulnerability, a sadness, something buried deep beneath the surface. She had no idea what it meant, but she couldn't help but wonder if it was a crack in the fortress he had built around himself. One evening, after dinner, she found herself alone in the large, empty living room, staring out at the darkened garden through the massive windows. The weight of her thoughts pressed down on her, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to think about Ethan. Her heart clenched at the memory of him, the man she had once loved, the man she had dreamed of spending her life with. It all felt so far away now, as if it belonged to a different life, a different person. She had no idea how to get back to that life, or if she even could. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Vu Hai entering the room, his expression unreadable. "You're up late," he said, his voice as calm and controlled as ever. She didn't answer, but he didn't seem to mind. He moved toward her, his presence like a shadow in the room. "I told you before," he continued, his voice softer now. "This is your life now. You need to learn to accept it." She didn't respond. What could she say? She didn't want this life. She didn't want him. But she had no choice. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" He paused, as if considering her question. For a moment, he seemed almost human. But that was fleeting, and his usual coldness quickly returned. "Because you're mine," he said simply. "And I don't share what's mine." The words sent a chill through her, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She had been broken too many times to let his words affect her anymore. But there was something about the way he said it that made her wonder. Was he just a man who wanted to control everything? Or was there more to him? She didn't know, and maybe she would never know. "You've been running from me since the day we met," he continued, his tone more thoughtful now. "You think you can hide, but you can't. You'll learn to accept this, just like you'll learn to accept me." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him she would never accept this, that she would never accept him. But deep down, she knew it was futile. She could fight him, but in the end, it was his world, and she was just a pawn in it. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "You think you have me all figured out, but you don't." Vu Hai's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I know more about you than you think," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I know what you need, whether you want to admit it or not." He stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming, and she instinctively took a step back. You need me, he said, his words almost a whisper now. And whether you like it or not, I'm not going anywhere. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since she arrived in this place, she felt a flicker of fear. Not fear for her life, but fear of something much worse. The fear of losing herself. She had already lost so much, but could she really let this man take everything from her? The thought was suffocating. I'll never be yours, she said, more to herself than to him. But Vu Hai's gaze remained unyielding, as if he had already won. You already are, he said simply. And one day, you'll realize that this life, this world, is all you need. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, feeling more lost than ever. The room felt colder now, and she wondered if she would ever find a way to escape his grasp. But deep down, she knew that as long as she remained in his world, escape would only be a distant dream. The following days were a constant battle between the tension of her captivity and the growing realization that there was no easy way out. Each morning, Vu Hai would check in on her, his presence filling the mansion like a shadow she couldn't escape. His voice, smooth and authoritative, echoed in her ears long after he was gone. You belong to me now, he would remind her, his words like an unshakable mantra. She had tried to resist, to hold on to some part of her old self, but the walls of the mansion, the coldness of his authority, and the isolation she felt from the outside world were wearing her down. She spent her days in the same rooms, pacing the expansive hallways, her mind restless with thoughts of escape. But there was no way out. Even when she felt she might go mad from the monotony, he was always watching. There were moments when she thought she might be able to run, when she thought she could get far enough, hide from him, and regain control of her life. But those moments were fleeting. Each time she attempted to break free, the reality of her situation hit her again. The mansion's security, the ever-watchful eyes of his men, and his cold, calculating presence kept her in check. No matter where she went, no matter what she tried to do, he was always one step ahead. It was as if she had no choice but to accept the life he had forced upon her. Her resistance had turned to exhaustion, and with that exhaustion came a strange sense of resignation. She no longer fought him every moment of the day. Instead, she learned to live within the confines of his world. Vu Hai, for all his coldness, had a way of keeping her close without smothering her completely. He would visit her daily, speaking to her in a calm, almost soothing tone that left her confused. He wasn't cruel, at least not in the way she expected him to be. His words, though authoritative, lacked the harshness she thought a mafia boss might have. He treated her like someone to be protected, but the protection felt more like ownership. You're here for a reason, he told her one evening, his voice low and controlled. And in time, you'll see that it's better this way. She didn't respond. What could she say? She had heard his words so many times, and yet, she couldn't find a way to accept them. Better? How could any of this be better? He saw her silence as acceptance, a soft smile crossing his lips as he moved closer, placing a hand on her shoulder with an unexpected tenderness. I know you don't trust me, he continued, his voice softening slightly. But you will. In time, you will understand why I'm doing this. His hand lingered on her shoulder, the warmth of his touch at odds with the coldness of his words. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of his presence, his touch, and the strange comfort it offered. But she quickly shook it off. She couldn't let herself fall into this false sense of security. She had to remember who he was, what he had done. He was the man who had stolen her life, and she would never forget that. But as the days passed, she found herself growing more and more numb. It wasn't that she had given up, but she had learned that fighting him constantly only drained her. And so, she focused on surviving. She learned his routines, his habits, the way he moved through his world. He was always busy, always wrapped up in his empire, but he never let her out of his sight for long. The tension between them, the power struggle, simmered just beneath the surface of their interactions. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make a move, but neither of them ever did. She spent her days in the mansion, mostly in silence, except when Vu Hai was around. He would come to check on her, bring her things she didn't ask for, and remind her of her place in his world. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made her feel trapped. It was his constant, unspoken claim over her. He would always remind her that she was his. One night, as she Sat by the window, staring out at the night sky, Vu Hai came to her room. She didn't even hear him enter. He was that quiet. He stood by the door for a moment, just watching her, before he finally spoke. "You're mine," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And you will learn to trust me." She didn't turn to face him, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I don't want this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this." There was a long pause, and for a moment, she thought he might leave, might finally give her the space she needed. But then he stepped forward, his presence overwhelming, his voice soft but insistent. "I didn't give you a choice," he said simply. "But you'll come to see that this is the life you need." She turned to face him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'll never need you," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Not like you think." He didn't flinch. Instead, he watched her with that cold, calculating look in his eyes, as if he had already won. "You'll see," he said softly. "In time, you'll see that you need me more than you think." His words stung, but she didn't let them break her. She would fight him, even if she had to do it silently, even if she had to do it in her own way. She wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The days blurred into one another, each one feeling like the last. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly alive. Each morning, she would wake up to the same cold silence, the same mansion, the same world she had been forced into. Vu Hai's presence was constant, like a shadow that she couldn't escape. His gaze never wavered, always watching, always assessing. She had stopped fighting. There was no point anymore. Every attempt to resist him only brought more frustration, and yet, part of her still refused to fully surrender. The anger, the pain, the confusion, it all simmered beneath the surface, a storm waiting to erupt. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Vu Hai approached her again, his presence filling the room with that same air of authority. She had been sitting by the window, staring out at the vast grounds of the mansion. But as he entered, she turned to face him. "You're still not eating," he said, his tone steady, with a hint of frustration. She didn't answer, but her eyes met his, defiant. He wasn't going to win. Not completely. "You can't avoid me forever," he continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I'm giving you everything you need. You should be grateful." Gratitude. The word twisted in her chest like a knife. How could she be grateful for a life she hadn't chosen, for a man who had stolen everything from her? "I don't need you," she said, her voice low but steady. "I never asked for your protection." Vu Hai didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on hers, cold and calculating. "You don't have a choice," he replied, his voice sharp now. "You'll learn to accept what I've given you. You will come to see that this is for the best." She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from the grip he had on her. But the truth was, she was trapped. There was nowhere to go, no way out. The power he held over her was absolute. "I won't stay here forever," she said, her voice tinged with quiet defiance. "You can't keep me here against my will." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can leave?" he asked softly, almost with a hint of amusement. "Where will you go? This is my world, and you're a part of it now. You're mine, whether you like it or not." His words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had never felt more trapped. The walls of the mansion, the security of his men, the constant surveillance, it all closed in on her. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him. There were moments, fleeting moments, when the cold exterior he showed to the world seemed to crack, and she saw something else. Something more human. She didn't know what it meant. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she knew there was more to him than the ruthless Mafia boss he projected. "I don't belong here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't my life." Vu Hai didn't answer right away. He simply watched her, his gaze piercing. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You belong with me," he said softly. "Whether you accept it or not, we are connected now. You have a place in my world." His words were like a promise and a threat all at once. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible? Could she truly be a part of his world? "I won't be your prisoner," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I won't be anyone's property." Vu Hai's expression didn't change. He was unreadable, his face a mask of control. "You're not a prisoner," he replied, his voice still calm. but there was a steel edge to it. You're mine, and I'll make sure you understand that in time. The words stung, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't let him see how much they affected her. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the door. I'm done with this, she muttered under her breath. But Vu Hai was quick to stop her. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist firmly, pulling her back to face him. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and commanding. Not without me. She tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. There was no escape. You think you can just walk away? He continued, his voice growing colder. You're mine, and there's no going back. His words echoed in her mind, and for a moment, she felt her resistance falter. Could he be right? Was there truly no way out? She looked at him, the man who had taken everything from her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was trapped, yes, but she wasn't completely powerless. There was still a part of her that refused to break. She had to hold on to that. No matter what he said, no matter how much he tried to control her, she would not give up. She would not let him win. I'm not yours, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. Vu Hai's gaze softened just a fraction, but the flicker of emotion was gone as quickly as it had appeared. We'll see, he said simply, his hand releasing her wrist. We'll see. As he turned to leave, she felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The battle between them was far from over, and this time, she was ready to fight back. The following days unfolded in a pattern that was beginning to feel almost suffocating. Each morning, she would wake to the silence of the mansion, knowing that Vu Hai would be watching her, keeping her confined to this world he had created. She had tried to maintain some semblance of control over her emotions, but the weight of his presence, his cold, unwavering gaze, and the constant reminders of her position wore her down more than she was willing to admit. Vu Hai's routine had become her own. Breakfast was served in her room every morning, brought by a silent staff member. He would check in on her at least once a day, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, though the answer was always the same. She didn't need anything from him, but the reality of her situation made those words feel hollow. The mansion had become a gilded cage, and no matter how hard she tried to escape it, she always found herself back in the same place. One afternoon, after a particularly silent breakfast, she found herself sitting by the large windows of her room, staring out at the vast grounds of the estate. The view was beautiful, the lush green grass stretching for what seemed like miles, the manicured trees lining the horizon. It was a world that seemed far removed from the one she had known, the one where she had control over her life, her choices. Now, she had nothing. She had no choices, no freedom, and no future. It was all controlled by him. The realization was like a stone sinking in her chest. What do you want from me? She whispered to herself, the words escaping before she could stop them. The question had been on her mind for days, but it felt like a question she was never meant to ask. It felt like a question that would never have an answer she could accept. The door to her room opened, and she turned to see Vu Hai standing in the doorway, his figure a stark contrast to the soft, light-filled room. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning her face, his expression unreadable. What's on your mind? He asked, his voice low and calm. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the flicker of defiance rise up inside her. I want to leave, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I want to go back to my life. His expression softened for just a moment, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that almost looked like regret. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold resolve she had grown accustomed to. You can't leave, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Not until I say so. The words hit her like a slap. She had known that escape was impossible, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel all the more real. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice quieter now. Why won't you just let me go? He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Because you're mine, he said simply, and I don't let go of what's mine. The words stung more than she expected. She had heard them before, of course, but hearing them in this moment, hearing the truth in them, made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. You don't own me, she said, her voice rising in anger. You don't get to control my life. His eyes darkened, the calmness replaced by something sharper, something more dangerous. You belong to me. he said, his voice low and menacing. You always have. She could feel her pulse quicken, the anger bubbling inside her. She wanted to scream, to tell him that he was wrong, to tell him that she would never accept this. But deep down, she knew that the longer she stayed in this mansion, the more she would lose of herself. She didn't want to be a pawn in his game. She didn't want to belong to him, no matter how much he tried to convince her that she did. I'll never belong to you, she said through gritted teeth, her body tense with defiance. You can try to break me, but I won't let you. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. You don't understand yet, he said softly. But you will. In time, you will learn that this life, this world, is all you need. He stepped closer again, his presence overwhelming. She felt the heat of his body, the tension in the air between them, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. You'll come to accept it, he said, his voice quiet now. You'll see that this is what you were meant for. The words were chilling. I wasn't meant for this, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I never asked for any of this. He reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his fingers warm against her skin. She wanted to pull away, to escape, but she couldn't. There was nowhere to go. You don't have to accept it right now, he said, his voice soft, almost reassuring. But you will. In time, you'll see that I'm not your enemy. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she once hoped he might be. But there was nothing there. Only the cold, calculating gaze of a man who saw her as a possession, someone to be controlled, someone to be molded into his world. She couldn't let him win. Not like this. But the longer she stayed in his world, the harder it was to remember who she was. You'll see, he said again, his hand still resting on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on her face. In time, you'll realize that I'm the only one who can give you what you need. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had been broken too many times to fight him anymore. But deep down, a part of her refused to give up completely. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to escape his world. But for now, all she could do was endure. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that felt almost physical, like someone had placed a weight over my ribs while I slept. The mansion was silent, the kind of silence that made every sound echo, reminding me that no matter how big this place was, I was still trapped inside it. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to piece together the fragments of myself that felt more scattered every day. The knock on the door was soft, but firm. I already knew who it was. Vuhai did not need to announce himself. His presence filled any space he entered long before he spoke. The door opened, and he stepped inside, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, his dark eyes fixed on me. He studied me for a long moment, his face unreadable. You did not eat dinner last night, he said, his voice calm, but the subtle shift in his tone carried a warning beneath it. I was not hungry, I replied, my voice quiet but steady. His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. It was not anger exactly. It was something sharper, something more layered. You are not taking care of yourself, he said. That is not acceptable. I let out a soft breath, frustration building in my chest. You do not get to tell me what is acceptable, I said. You do not get to control every part of my life. He stepped closer, and for a moment I wondered if he could hear my heartbeat racing. His presence had a way of pulling the air out of the room. You are in my world, he said quietly. And in my world, I protect what is mine. The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I felt that familiar spark of anger rise again. I am not yours, I said. No matter how many times you say it, I am not. His eyes darkened, a shadow crossing his features. You can deny it all you want, he said. But that does not change the truth. I stood, stepping back from him, needing space. Your truth is not mine, I said. You took everything from me. My life, my future, my freedom. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something like regret. But it disappeared just as quickly as it came. I did what needed to be done, he said. You are safer here than out there. Safe. I repeated, my voice trembling. You call this safe? You call this protection? He did not answer. Instead, he watched me with that same measured, unreadable intensity that made my skin crawl. I could never tell what he was thinking, or what he planned to do next. You think you know everything about me, I said, trying to steady my breath. But you do not. That seemed to catch his attention. He took another step toward me, his voice softer now. Then tell me, he said. Tell me what I do not know. His tone surprised me. It was not a command. It was something close to curiosity, but I did not trust it. I crossed my arms, looking away. It does not matter, I said. You would not care. He moved again, slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. You are wrong, he said quietly. I care about more than you think. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I forgot how to speak. There was something different in his eyes. Something I had not seen before. Vulnerability. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there. He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, his touch warm and unexpected. You think I wanted this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You think I wanted to take you away from your life? I stared at him, confused. Did you not? His jaw tightened. I did what I had to do, he said. But it was never about hurting you. His words hit me harder than I expected. They did not excuse anything he had done, but they unsettled me. I stepped back, needing distance, needing clarity. I do not understand you, I said. I do not understand any of this. He watched me closely, his expression softening in a way that made my chest tighten. You will, he said. In time. There it was again. That promise. That threat. That inevitability. I swallowed hard, my voice barely steady. You cannot keep me here forever. He held my gaze for a long moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. I will keep you for as long as it takes, he said, until you finally see that you belong here. With me. His words terrified me, not because they were forceful, but because of the conviction behind them. And the terrifying part was that for the first time, I did not know if I had the strength to fight him forever. The following days were filled with a strange quiet. Vuhai seemed to have gone out of his way to give her space, but even in his absence, the weight of his presence lingered. The mansion, with all its opulence and grandeur, felt more like a prison than ever. Every corner, every room, every breath seemed to echo his words, his claim over her. You belong to me, he had said. And no matter how many times she denied it, those words rang in her ears, echoing in the hollow parts of her mind. She had spent most of her days alone, staring out at the vast grounds from the large windows in her room, wondering if there was any chance for escape, any glimmer of hope that she could get away. But each time she allowed herself to think about freedom, the walls of the mansion seemed to grow higher, the gates seemed to stretch further away. There was no escape. At least, not yet. The days turned into weeks, and the unease in her chest began to turn into something else. It was a strange mix of resignation and acceptance. She couldn't change her situation, couldn't make the world she was trapped in disappear, so she tried to find ways to survive within it. She stopped fighting him in the ways she had before, stopped yelling and pushing back. Instead, she began to observe him more closely. He was always there, always watching, always in control. But there were moments, brief moments, when he would let down his guard, when she would see a crack in the cold exterior. It was in the small things. The way his hand would linger for just a second too long on her shoulder, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her late at night, his eyes searching hers for something that she could never quite name. She knew that he was trying to break her down, trying to force her to accept the life he had decided for her. But what terrified her more than anything was the creeping realization that she was starting to depend on him, just a little. It wasn't that she wanted to. It wasn't that she had chosen this, but the more she allowed herself to stay in this world, the more she felt her resistance slipping away. And that terrified her more than anything else. One evening, after dinner, she found herself alone in the garden, walking aimlessly along the manicured paths. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was cool against her skin. It was quiet, too quiet, and she found herself wishing for some sound, something to distract her from the silence in her own mind. You shouldn't be out here alone. The voice came from behind her, and she turned to see Vuhai approaching, his figure looming in the dim light. He had a way of making his presence known, even in the stillness of the night. I like it here, she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. It's peaceful. He smiled, but it was a cold smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. You may like the peace now, but it won't last long. She frowned, not understanding what he meant. What do you mean? He stepped closer, his presence like a storm cloud, filling the space around her. You can't hide from this forever, he said, his voice quiet, almost soft. You're mine, and that doesn't change. She looked at him, her heart racing, a mix of defiance and fear rising within her. I'm not yours, she said firmly, her voice steady. He chuckled softly, the sound dark and low. You will be, he said, his eyes narrowing. You already are, even if you refuse to accept it. She shook her head, feeling the familiar rush of anger and frustration. I won't be, she said, her voice stronger now. I won't let you control me. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze steady and intense. It was as if he were measuring her, testing her resolve. Finally, he spoke. You say that now, he said softly. But the truth is, you don't have a choice. You're already mine. And soon, you'll realize that this is where you belong. The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she felt like the air had been knocked out of her. How could he be so sure? How could he say that with such confidence, such certainty? She took a step back, shaking her head. You don't know me, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You don't know anything about me. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers warm against her skin. It was the first time he had touched her without any force, without any demand, and for some strange reason, it made her heart race. I know more than you think, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. And in time, you will understand. She pulled away from him, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. I don't want to understand, she said fiercely. I don't want any part of this. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. You will, he said again. And when you do, you will understand why this is the only way. The certainty in his voice made her want to scream, to run, to do anything to break free. But there was nothing left. No escape. No way out. I'll never accept this, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze softening just slightly. You will, he said, his voice quiet now. You'll see. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the garden, feeling more lost than ever. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, she found herself drawn deeper into the world Vu Hai had created for her. His presence was constant, his control undeniable. She had hoped, for a time, that she could hold on to the life she had once known, the life that had belonged to her before this man had come into it. But the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Every small act of resistance felt like an echo in the emptiness of the mansion, and the more she fought, the more it seemed like nothing could change. The world outside the mansion was a distant memory. The city, the freedom, the life she had built, all of it felt as far away as another lifetime. She had no contact with anyone, no messages, no calls, no way to reach the people she once loved. Her world had shrunk to the size of the mansion's walls, and no matter how much she longed for an escape, it felt impossible. Vu Hai's presence loomed over her like a storm cloud, and yet, every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of something softer, something almost human, beneath his cold exterior. It confused her, disturbed her, and she hated herself for even noticing it. His control over her was not just physical, but psychological. His words, his gaze, his touch, they all had a way of breaking down her defenses. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Vu Hai found her sitting alone by the window again, her gaze lost in the view of the moonlit garden. He had been watching her for a while now, waiting for the right moment to speak, to remind her of the life she had with him, whether she wanted it or not. You look distant tonight, he said as he entered the room, his voice smooth as always. But there was something different in his tone, something softer, almost concerned. She didn't answer right away. How could she? What was there to say? Her thoughts were a storm of confusion, anger, and fear, all swirling together in her mind. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. What is it? He asked, his voice low, almost tender. Are you thinking about leaving again? The words made her stomach tighten, but she didn't let him see the effect they had on her. She turned away, looking out at the night, hoping the stillness of the world outside might calm her racing heart. I'm not thinking about leaving, she said quietly. I'm just thinking about what my life has become. He didn't move, didn't speak, but she could feel him there, standing just behind her, watching. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Why won't you just let me go?" He was silent for a moment, his footsteps heavy as he crossed the room to stand beside her. "I told you," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "You are mine now, and you will learn that this is where you belong." His words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. He was right, wasn't he? She belonged here now, whether she liked it or not. She had no choice. The mansion had become her cage, and Vu Hai had the key. She looked at him, her heart heavy with defeat. "I never wanted this," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to belong to you." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. His touch was warm, but it only made her feel more lost, more confused. "You didn't choose this," he said softly. "But it's not a life you have to hate. You can find peace here, with me. You can find happiness." His words, once again, had that soft, almost convincing tone, the one that made her feel like she was starting to believe him, even though every part of her resisted. She wanted to shake it off, to remind herself of who she was, of the life she had left behind. But the longer she stayed in this world, the more it felt like her old life was slipping away. "I don't know if I can ever trust you," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence between them. "I don't know if I'll ever believe in you." He stood there for a moment, his eyes searching hers, before he spoke again. "You don't need to trust me," he said, his voice low and steady. "You just need to accept what is. In time, you will see that I'm not your enemy. I'm here to protect you." Her heart tightened at his words, but she refused to let herself be fooled. Protection? Was that what this was? A twisted version of protection that trapped her in a world she didn't choose? The thought made her want to scream. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't accept you." Vu Hai didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "You will," he said softly. "And when you do, everything will be easier. For both of us." She looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't know if she could ever accept this life. She didn't know if she could ever truly be a part of his world. But one thing was certain, she was trapped in it now, and the only thing left was to survive. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but not today." He smiled then, just the faintest curve of his lips, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her feel like she might be wrong. Maybe this wasn't about breaking her after all. Maybe it was about something else. But she couldn't trust him yet. Not fully. And so, for now, she would hold on to the part of herself that refused to be completely lost to him. The battle was far from over. In the world of dark romance, where power and control define every relationship, a young woman finds herself trapped in the clutches of a ruthless mafia boss. Forced into a life she never wanted, she struggles to maintain her independence while being constantly reminded of her place in his world. As the tension between them builds, the lines between hate and desire blur, and she is forced to confront her growing feelings toward the very man who has taken everything from her. This dark romance explores themes of control, submission, and forbidden attraction, as the protagonist grapples with the complexities of her captivity and the undeniable pull of the man who controls her life. Through every twist and turn, the story unfolds with gripping intensity, showing the darker side of love and power. The tension builds to an undeniable climax in this dark romance, where escape seems impossible and submission becomes inevitable. Will she learn to accept her place in his world, or will she continue to fight back against the pull of this dangerous and irresistible love? Dive into this dark romance where every moment is filled with mystery, danger, and a forbidden love that will leave you breathless.